Okay, let's dive in. You hear these stories almost like dark humor coming out of Taiwan, like guides at the National Palace Museum joking that, well, the priceless art inside is Taiwan's real defense shield because China wouldn't dare bomb it.
Yeah, it's a coping mechanism, I suppose. But it really speaks volumes about the underlying anxiety, doesn't it?
It really does. That laugh kind of masks this growing sense of unease, this real
Or a
tension.
sense of vulnerability, Desi.
Exactly. And that's what we're really digging into today. We're looking at these recent Chinese military drills and asking, are they just about invasion practice, or is something else going on?
Like a shift towards a blockade strategy, maybe.
Precisely, a blockade, or perhaps this idea of a quarantine. And maybe even more critically, can China actually wear down Taiwan's will to resist without a full-blown conflict? We've got some analysis here that tries to unpack this. So our mission for you, the listener, is to, cut through the noise. Let's try to pinpoint the key signs, understand China's potential playbook, Taiwan's challenges, and of course, the global fallout.
Right, so let's start with that feeling you mentioned, that sense of foreboding in Taiwan. The analysis suggests it's palpable. China's growing military power isn't abstract, it's felt daily.
Constant pressure, harassment, basically.
Yeah, and you have to wonder, with everything else going on globally, geopolitical instability, does that give Beijing maybe an opportunity, a window to test new intimidation tactics?
That makes sense. The sort of established world order feels a bit shaky. Maybe other powers are distracted. So maybe Beijing sees an opening to push boundaries, test the waters with Taiwan. This whole gray zone aggression idea fits right in.
Exactly. Action short of war. And it looks like the military drills themselves are changing, too.
How so?
Well, traditionally, lots of focus on amphibious landings, right? Beach assaults.
The classic invasion scenario.
But now the sources highlight more practice for naval blockades. There's even a map showing these exercise zones, sort of ringing the island.
Okay, so a strategic shift in focus.
Potentially. And they're also testing things like new barge-borne bridges.
What for?
Seems like a way to speed up troop movement, maybe open up more potential landing spots if they did go for an invasion. Logistics, logistics, logistics.
So keeping options open, but maybe leaning more towards applying pressure differently.
It could be. And then you have these specific exercises like Straight Thunder 2025A.
The name itself sounds ominous. 2025A implies there might be a B. C?
Could be. And these reportedly simulated bombing key targets. Ports, energy facilities, really vital infrastructure.
Hitting where it hurts.
And there's this quote, supposedly from a PLA officer, basically boasting, saying that cutting off Taiwan's sea supply lines would wreck their social order, their livelihoods.
Oof, that's blunt. It's not just military posturing, it's psychological warfare, isn't it?
Absolutely. It directly targets Taiwan's known vulnerabilities.
And those are pretty stark. I mean, the numbers on import dependence.
They're staggering. Fuel, something like 96% imported.
Yeah.
And that includes almost all the LNG, the liquefied natural gas.
Which powers a huge chunk of their electricity, right?
Yeah, about 42%. And then food, around 70% of the calories people consume are imported.
So if those sea lanes get choked off, even partially,
the impact would be almost immediate and severe.
And thinking bigger picture, the global economy relies heavily on Taiwan, too.
Oh, absolutely. Advanced semiconductors. Taiwan dominates something like 90% of the really cutting-edge chips via TSMC.
A bottleneck the world can't afford.
And the Taiwan Strait itself is just a massive shipping lane for global trade. Any disruption there, it sends shockwaves everywhere.
Okay, so the blockade threat is real, the impact potentially catastrophic. But you mentioned this cognitive warfare angle earlier.
Right. It's not just about ships and planes. It's about getting inside people's heads.
How does that work?
Well, the constant military drills are part of it. Makes the threat feel ever-present. Then there are incidents like undersea communication cables being cut.
Which has actually happened, right?
Yes. It disrupts communication, isolates the island, and then there's the rhetoric, the propaganda. It's all designed to wear Taiwan down.
Sow doubt.
Sow doubt. Exhaust them, make them question if the U.S. would really show up if things got bad, undermine faith in their protectors.
So how effective do you think that can be? Sustain psychological pressure?
It's hard to measure precisely, but the goal is clear. Create a sense of inevitability, make resistance seem futile.
Now, the analysis draws a distinction between a full naval blockade and something called a quarantine. What's the difference?
Well, Bonnie Glaser points out that a full blockade is pretty unambiguous. It's almost certainly an act of war, and it really increases the odds of a U.S. military response.
But might not guarantee Taiwan gives up.
Exactly. A quarantine, though, it's Potentially more ambiguous. It might be led by, say, the Coast Guard instead of the Navy.
A bit fuzzier legally.
Perhaps. As Li Junyi suggests, China could try to frame it not as a military blockade, but as, well, domestic law enforcement.
Like customs checks.
Right.
Or disease control. Preventing weapons smuggling.
Right. Things that sound less like acts of war. It gives Beijing maybe more wiggle room, more space to de-escalate if needed.
Is that where the cabbage strategy comes in?
Yeah, that fits this gray zone approach, using multiple layers, Navy, Coast Guard, and their maritime militia, those fishing boats.
Right, the militia.
To slowly tighten the squeeze, layer by layer, like wrapping a cabbage, incrementally increasing pressure without necessarily crossing that red line into declared war.
And China's already doing things that chip away at the status quo, aren't they?
Oh, constantly. The analysis lists several examples. Flying planes across the median line in the Strait. That used to be rare, now it's routine.
Entering Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, the ADIZ.
Regularly. Probing waters near the outlying islands, even inspecting Taiwanese civilian ships sometimes.
Little nudges, constantly pushing the envelope.
Each action might seem small, but together they normalize a greater Chinese presence and challenge Taiwan's control over its surroundings. Death by 1,000 cuts. Sort of.
So facing all this, how ready is Taiwan? What are their defenses?
Well, the analysis notes they have a pretty decent civil defense system, partly because they're used to natural disasters like typhoons and earthquakes.
Okay, that's something.
But the energy vulnerability we talked about, that's critical. Currently only about 11 days of LNG storage, projected to reach maybe 14 days by 2027.
That's not a lot, especially if imports are cut off.
Not a lot at all. And they're phasing out nuclear power, which makes them more reliant on that imported LNG. It's a major weak spot.
A huge vulnerability China could exploit. What about food?
Food seems a bit better. They're largely self-sufficient in rice, apparently, and have stockpiles of things like meat. So maybe more resilience there.
Okay, but information. Those undersea cables.
That's another big worry.
Yeah.
There are, 14 international cables connecting Taiwan? Hugely important for internet communication, and they are vulnerable.
Can they be cut easily?
Relatively easily, yes. Sabotage or even accidental damage from ship anchors. Taiwan's exploring alternatives, microwave links, satellites.
Like Starlink.
Well, it actually rejected Starlink. Concerns about regulations and maybe, Elon Musk's business ties in China. So finding reliable alternatives with enough bandwidth is tough.
So information isolation is a real threat, too. It feels like a key battleground.
Definitely. Disrupting communications is a powerful tool in modern conflict. It isolates people, hampers coordination, damages morale.
And physically stopping ships in a blockade. Taiwan's Coast Guard is much smaller than China's, right?
Considerably smaller.
Yeah.
So they're looking at asymmetric ideas, like trying to establish safe, green routes for essential ships.
How would that work?
It's unclear how viable it would be under pressure. And there's even talk of using civilian cargo ships as obstacles.
Really? Using commercial vessels to block Chinese ships?
It sounds like a desperate measure, honestly.
Yeah.
Huge risks involved for the ships and crews. It feels like mostly buying time.
Buying time for what? External help.
That seems to be the underlying hope, that countries like Japan or the Philippines, or especially the U.S., would intervene.
There has been talk in the U.S. about maybe organizing convoys to break a blockade, hasn't there?
Yes, discussions about it. But then you hit the big question mark. Would the U.S. actually do it? Especially with political uncertainty.
Yeah, the unpredictability factor. Past rhetoric about alliances, trade wars, even comments about Taiwan stealing the semiconductor industry.
It all feeds into doubt. And China knows this. They watch U.S. politics very closely. That uncertainty is something they can leverage in their cognitive warfare campaign.
Though some voices in the U.S. seem to be shifting too. Elbridge Colby, for instance.
Right. He used to focus more on just containing China, but now seems to be questioning if defending Taiwan is truly existential for the U.S. given the massive potential cost.
And suggesting Taiwan needs to spend way more on its own defense.
Which is politically difficult in Taiwan. Getting full parliamentary backing for huge defense budget hikes isn't easy, especially with the current political divisions.
Ah, the internal politics. That brings us right to the core question. Taiwan's own will to resist. What's the view from inside Taiwan?
Well, one official quote, it says, "A blockade is an act of war, plain and simple. It warrants a military response."
Okay, but a quarantine.
That's seen as damaging, very serious, but maybe not something that automatically means surrender. It's a grayer area.
But there's that concerning poll data from Brookings.
Yeah, showing declining trust among Taiwanese people that the U.S. would actually intervene militarily.
And that erosion of trust, that must be exactly what Beijing wants to see, right?
Absolutely. If Taiwanese people and leaders doubt U.S. help is coming, it weakens their resolve. It feeds directly into China's strategy.
To make resistance seem hopeless.
Precisely. They apparently talk about this peeping model.
Peeping, as in the old name for Beijing.
Right. Referring to the relatively bloodless surrender of the city back in 1949 during the Civil War, the idea is to achieve unification without a massive fight.
So the goal is surrender through pressure and psychological manipulation, not necessarily conquest.
That seems to be the ideal scenario for Beijing. Convinced Taiwan resistance is futile. And they're working internally, too, reports of increased espionage cases, cracking down on infiltration.
Trying to undermine Taiwan from within.
Trying to find leverage points, collaborators maybe, undermine cohesion.
It's interesting, though, sometimes in the past, Chinese aggression has actually united Taiwan, hasn't it? Backfired on them.
It has. But the analysis suggests this time feels different. More precarious, perhaps. The narrative pushed by pro-China media that the U.S. is unreliable will abandon Taiwan.
That narrative seems to be getting some traction.
It appears so, especially when combined with U.S. political uncertainty and isolationist rhetoric.
And Taiwan has its own internal political drama right now. Big time.
Yeah, major tension between the president, who's from the DPP, and the legislature, the Legislative Yuan, which is currently controlled by the opposition KMT.
And the KMT generally favors closer ties with China, right?
Traditionally, yes. And they've been pushing laws to expand Parliament's power over the executive and, significantly, making cuts to the defense and Coast Guard budgets.
Cutting defense spending now.
Exactly. The president and prime minister have warned that this is dangerous, that it undermines Taiwan's security and sends the wrong signal internationally.
But the KMT is pushing ahead. It sounds like these domestic divisions could really play into China's hands.
They certainly create vulnerabilities Beijing can exploit. Budget cuts, political infighting. It potentially signals weakness or lack of resolve.
But views aren't monolithic across Taiwan, are they? There's that example from Hualien.
Right. In places like Hualien on the East Coast, some people see closer economic ties with the mainland as beneficial.
Like the pomelo imports.
Exactly. China lifted a ban on pomelos, specifically from Hualien, after a KMT delegation visited the mainland. It's a clear example of China using economic carrots, targeting specific regions to try and win favor or create divisions.
So targeted economic incentives alongside the military pressure and political maneuvering. It's multifaceted.
Very much so. It highlights the complex mix of identity, economics, and security shaping opinions across Taiwan.
And recent polls. They don't sound great for the current government or for confidence generally.
No, the data mentioned suggests President Lai's approval rating has dipped. Efforts by his party, the DPP, to recall some KMT legislators haven't really caught fire.
And the distrust of the U.S., especially under a potential Trump presidency.
Reportedly quite high. And there's this growing pessimism, it seems, about maintaining the status quo indefinitely. More people apparently expect eventual unification.
Wow, that's a significant shift if it's a lasting trend.
It could be. There are also mentions of younger voters feeling frustrated, perhaps, that the DPP focuses so much on resisting China, maybe neglecting everyday issues.
Like jobs, housing, the economy.
Possibly. And compounding this is a reported lack of really realistic, large-scale wartime drills for ordinary civilians. It doesn't exactly build confidence and preparedness.
So putting it all together, we keep circling back to this core question, don't we? Can China actually sap Taiwan's will to resist?
It seems to be the central thrust of their current strategy. Using this mix of military intimidation, economic leverage, political interference, and psychological operations.
To make Taiwan feel divided, isolated, and maybe doubtful about its future and its allies.
That appears to be the goal. To create an environment where resistance feels unsustainable, and maybe, just maybe, unification becomes seen by enough people as the only viable path.
Okay, so let's try to quickly sum up this deep dive. We've seen a definite shift, or at least a strong emphasis, in Chinese military drills towards blockade and quarantine scenarios alongside invasion prep.
Right. And Taiwan has real vulnerabilities. Energy is a huge one. Information links too.
External support, particularly from the U.S., feels, well, uncertain. At least that uncertainty is a major factor.
A huge factor.
Mm.
And internally, Taiwan is grappling with significant political divisions that Beijing seems very keen to exploit.
All feeding into this strategy aimed at eroding the collective will to fight back.
Exactly. It's a complex, dangerous mix of military, economic, and political pressure. The chances of some kind of coercive action short of invasion seem to be rising.
Taiwan's future seems to hang on its military readiness, yes, but maybe just as much on its internal unity and the perceived reliability of its friends.
That sums it up well.
So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. Looking at this tangled web, the military moves, the economic levers, the internal politics, the global uncertainty, what do you think is the most likely path forward in the Taiwan Strait over the next few years? Is it continued gray zone pressure, a quarantine, something else?
And crucially, what wild card could change everything? A sudden shift in U.S. policy, a major crisis elsewhere, an unexpected development inside China or Taiwan.
What unforeseen event could completely alter the trajectory for this incredibly vital region and, by extension, the global order? Definitely something to keep thinking about.